welcome to the show where we share the stories of the many who intersect with our healthcare system but are rarely heard from. My name is Kevin Poe, founder and editor of Kevin MD. Today in the show, we have Kara Wada. She is an allergist immunologist, and she wrote the Kevin MD article, Burnout and Bias, or Medical Gaslighting. Kara, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me on, Kevin. I really appreciate it.
We'll get into your article in a little bit, but first off, can you share your story and journey to where you are today?
Absolutely. So I am a practicing pediatric and adult allergist immunologist. I work at Ohio State Wexner Medical Center, did my training in MedPeds here, stayed on for fellowship. But life really took an interesting turn a couple years ago. Within about 2 weeks, I was diagnosed with Sjögren syndrome, and my daughter was diagnosed with egg allergy. And so we went from this seemingly healthy family to having some chronic medical issues. And I think that really served as a turning point in our life as a family, and also my journey as a physician too, in really experiencing the medical system, not only as a physician, but also as a chronic illness patient.
All right, so let's talk about that in your article that you wrote, Burnout and Bias or Medical Gaslighting. Now, for those who didn't get a chance to read that article, can you go more into your story about you and your daughter and how it changed you?
What I think, has been interesting is we all turn to different support mechanisms as we are navigating crises in our lives. I think now more than ever, we've realized that some of us turn to humor, some of us turn to, digging into the literature or to support groups. And I think I've turned to all of them at some point or another. But I found a lot of really great support within the chronic illness community. And that has really, I think, grown considerably over the pandemic as everyone's been locked down. And I kept coming across this particular term called medical gaslighting, which, over conversations with my husband, who happens to be a physician as well, kind of discussing some of the feelings that come along with using that term. Really, I have some additional training in medical education. So kind of looking at this from how can we approach the physician-patient relationship to help these patients who are high health utilization patients, really looking for answers about their health. How can we help them navigate it? But also realizing that as physicians, we are in a different experience than many of us started our careers. We have new pressures that we are working within, whether it's time constraints or numbers of patients we need to see. We all know with, many episodes and articles that I've, encountered even on your blog talking about burnout versus moral injury and how one of the first things we lose is our empathy for our patients. And so how can we reconcile with all of these forces that seemingly are coming upon our physician-patient relationship and really come back to why most of us all went into medicine, which was to help people.
So when you come across this term, medical gaslighting, in the chronic patient support forums, give us some context into when that term is normally used in.
So many patients will report either in the clinic or, on the social media forums that they have these feelings where they have either felt that their symptoms have not been taken seriously. They've either been completely brushed off or told that symptoms maybe were in their head, those sorts of experiences. And it's not uncommon, in particular in an academic allergy immunology practice. I see some patients who've been to multiple different specialists, or I'm the third, fourth person they've seen for a particular problem, and will many times get frustrated with not having answers. And so that's where this terminology tends to come up.
From your standpoint as an allergy immunology physician, when reading these forums and talking to some of these patients, how's that changed you as a physician?
One of the things that's changed considerably is trying to be the best listener I can be with the time constraints we do have. I may not always be able to explain a patient's symptoms with the physiology, anatomy, all that knowledge that I know, I may not be able to explain that or understand that fully, but I can still listen. I can tell them that I hear them, and I can validate that, that they've had that experience. And I sometimes will frankly tell them, I don't know why you've had that particular symptom. I don't have the science to necessarily explain that, but I hear that you're experiencing that, and let's try to work together to find a solution to what's impairing your quality of life.
So I certainly agree with you. And a lot of times I do primary care internal medicine, and I see a lot of chronic illness as well. And sometimes we just simply don't know. A lot of patients, they come to me after seeing 4 or 5 doctors. And if I always say that if it was a clear answer, we already would have told you already. So when you tell patients that you simply don't know what's going on, in general, what are some of their responses?
I've gotten good feedback, especially when I've just blatantly said, I hear you. And I'm sorry for your experience, especially if it's been a negative experience. That seems to really help, I think, engender some of that therapeutic trust with the patient. I think also offering to partner with them, that I may not have the answers, but I am going to do my best within my purview and what I, kind of my area of expertise, and or working with those colleagues that I work with or can turn to. I think one of the great things about, increased communication and social media and everything is having more communication with our colleagues who may have some real specialized expertise in certain areas, and helping make those connections has been really helpful too.
So in your article, you talk about some other ways that we could rebuild a therapeutic trust with our patients. What are some other ways we can do that?
I think being upfront also with patients about what your limitations are. I think there are many times patients don't necessarily understand that we are juggling, sometimes a couple dozen patients a day, depending on the practice. And that you may not get to telephone encounters, immediately, or what is the turnaround time you should expect for lab results, those sorts of things. Putting that up front in one way, shape, or form, I think can be really helpful for patients. What is an appropriate use of the patient portal messages? This is something I am still working on, but that this is a great opportunity to have more connection with your physician and your care team. But at the same right, there's only so many of us, and we are also, working on balancing as well. I think it restores some humanity to us as physicians as well, that we're not perfect, and that we have our own limitations. I think the other thing that's really important is being willing to rethink. And I think that's incredibly difficult when we're under time constraints, or we are dealing with burnout or moral injury, whatever we want to label it as. But trying to come to a complex or difficult situation that a patient is dealing with, and come at it with curiosity, and trying to put ourselves back in the shoes of when we were maybe a first or second year medical student, and every case was a really interesting case. That's not necessarily easy, and it's not feasible for every patient. But in those situations where you keep coming against the wall, I think that can be helpful. And I think the other thing that has kept me humble, in particular within the field of allergy immunology, is realizing we as human beings are still evolving. We're still discovering. We know a whole lot, and we know a whole lot more about our anatomy or physiology, how and why things go wrong in our bodies. But we as a species are still evolving, and we have conditions, especially within the field of allergy, that we've only known about for maybe 25 years. For instance, eosinophilic esophagitis is one that comes to mind. And if you ask GI physicians or allergists who are at the latter parts of their careers, this is a pretty new entity, that there were maybe a few cases here or there, the canaries in the coal mine. And now we're seeing, a large number of patients with these conditions. And so, I think having some sense of being humble that some of these patients may turn out to having a new condition that we don't fully understand, and to to brush them off or rebuff them, we can maybe try to approach that with a little more empathy and understanding.
We're talking to Kara Wada. She is an allergist immunologist, and she wrote the Kevin MD article, Burnout and Bias, or Medical Gaslighting. Kara, as you go through your journey as a patient and also the journey of your daughters as she's a patient, what's something that you've learned over the last little while that you didn't know before going through that journey?
I think one is trying to be patient with my colleagues. I also really realized the need to advocate for yourself. I had a pretty significant flare up 18 months, 2 years, actually 2 years ago, where I had some pretty significant liver injury, and really had to advocate and push to pursue that workup. And I think, instilling that in patients, that sometimes you do have to be the squeaky wheel to make sure you're getting kind of timely and adequate care. And then the other thing that I think has been really humbling is navigating the insurance network and, co-pays and in-network, out-of-network. That is a whole new education. And I give our patients who navigate that well so much credit, because it honestly, I think one could require a degree sometimes to navigate how best to go through the system that is medicine and not end up bankrupt or in some pretty significant financial troubles. And so I think that is also something else that's been really humbling on this journey.
And my final question, what's your take-home message that you want to leave with the Kevin MD audience?
I just encourage my fellow clinicians to actively listen, to be upfront about limitations, and to really be willing to rethink a situation, even if it takes that extra 5 minutes, that can really mean a considerable amount to someone who is struggling with symptoms that are impacting their quality of life day after day, and enough to bring them to your office to see you. And they wouldn't be there in almost all cases, they wouldn't be there if it wasn't impacting them. And so I think, stepping into those shoes for a moment, and also being willing to allow them to step into your shoes for a moment too, to show that you are human. And that's where kind of sharing those boundaries or limitations can be really helpful in navigating that physician-patient relationship.
Kara, thank you so much for sharing your story, time, and insight. And thanks again for being on the show.
Thanks so much, Kevin. I appreciate it.